I want to write about the blueberries I picked from the throat of a New England fall afternoon. How my hands plucked each branch like a familiar melody, and suddenly it was 2008. I am small and unremarkable, standing in a blueberry orchard in Northern California with my cousins. Maybe summer is a form of muscle memory. I mean to say, this is a poem about muscle memory, a phenomenon which, after decades of studies, still has no explanation. A leading theory suggests that memories undergo consolidation, the process of stabilization from short to long-term memory. Perhaps it suffices that we can infer the existence of a thing without knowing its internal structure. How a pianist's body remembers not the music, but the hollow dancing it leaves behind. My professor tells us of the axiom of choice. Metaphorically speaking, it too is a form of unconscious memory. It says, given a tree with infinite branches, it is possible to pick one blueberry from each branch. That's not the point. I mean, logic is not inherent to every system of choice is not inherent to every system of logic. This is not the first time I learned this, and it was not in the context of math or countries or bodies. I mean, I want to write a poem about home and not have to mean country or death, or how those two can be so easily mistaken for one another. One could say this is a consequence of neither concept being well-defined. A professor warns me that the axiom of choice leads to many mathematical paradoxes that violate our conceptions of space and time. Such ill-desired behavior is labeled pathological. For instance, it is possible to decompose one sphere into two identical spheres, hence four, hence infinitely many. From one life stems two, hence four, since infinitely many. One could say death is poorly defined in such a logical framework. Consider, for instance, the ancestors resurrected in every poem. Perhaps this is the job of the poet, to give language to that which cannot be constructed, to uneviscerate the flesh, to give muscle memory to every phantom limb, or maybe it was the lurch of my gut the last time I visited my queer aunt's unmarked grave. How even in remembrance her ghost was but an erasure of her former self. It is important to mention that the last woman I loved was buried in that same cemetery, just yards away, and I have spanned entire galaxies and failed poems trying to reconstruct her laughter. How the body remembers not the lover, but the music she left behind. How the last time I visited her grave, the gray skies parted, no metaphor, leaking light for the first time all week, and in coincidence or faith, I am inclined to call that grace. I want to write about tiny miracles. I woke up this morning. One could say the repetition in the previous sentence is an instance of pathological behavior, or perhaps the first instance of pathological behavior was the first time I mentioned the word country, or the space between countries and bodies in line 12. Or perhaps, since this is a poem about memory, it is discontinuous by necessity. There are hands, hence there will always be breakage. Neurologists argue against consolidation, say perhaps memories never stabilize, but are encoded in parallel architectures. This suggests that we encode reality in multiplicities, hence every perception of reality is, by construction, a multiverse of complexity. I want to write about the first Arab I met in grad school like she wasn't a miracle, or maybe every Palestinian I meet is a parallel universe. I want to write about New Year's Eve in Bethlehem, the house swelling with cousins and their pillow fight laughter. I want to talk about George, who was always the first to throw a pillow but had the sweetest face when his mother came around. His father outside roasting kebab, talking about those fuckers and their checkpoints ruining his morning commute. And Natalie, who paraded around the house with her hand-stitched gowns throughout the house like she owned the place. In the same breath, she lectured us on God's grace, how Jesus cured her cancer before the chemo could. I want to write about Nadia, who knew more English than her mother and still counted down to midnight in Arabic, the whole house dancing to a music they didn't know but understood. I want to remember my homeland this way, the city alight but not ablaze. I want to write about nights in Palestine where the last thing we thought about was death. About being smoked out in Ramallah like she knows she'll rise with a steel-tipped boot to the face. That reality exists without saying, so give us tonight to dance without words. Let me write about home without writing about its unbecoming, and I confess I've spent too much time revolving around my own unbecoming, the way time dilates around a black hole, reality diverging at the point where not even light escapes. I confess, dear reader, that by reading this, you have become my new test subject. I speak speak not of this poem, but of the memory of it. The parallel worlds your mind will inhabit, patching together my every image in your universe of perception. I mean to say, there will always be a universe in your mind, and in that universe there will always be a Palestine with children laughing. And it follows that every poem is a false god of sorts, maybe not in the sin, but in the confession of it, in the unraveling between poem and reality and perception of poem. I began this poem with blueberries and hands, or maybe I never had control over this narrative, being ill-defined. When I say his hands smelled like blueberries, I mean California 2008, I am small and insignificant. Philadelphia 2015, yes, he made a massacre of me. Yes, I was his for the taking. I am small, I am insignificant. The poem is both circling back and diverging at once. The poem is assuming multiple realities. The poem does not converge, but it does remember what the reader cannot. For the hands, for instance, the poem remembers the hands, but the poem does not converge. The poem remembers always the hands. The poem does not converge. The poem does not converge. The system does not converge. The system fails to converge.